things he did and all the stuff he'd say. All the people in his life who stole his heart away. They came to him with open wounds and he taught them how to paint. With kindness and laughter, let us reacquaint. Love called in like a river, rolling to the sea. From the mountains to the wheat fields to a place in history.
I guess if I think about it, I got into art therapy at 4 years old. Now that sounds funny, but in my writing I mentioned that I drowned at 4 years old and was resuscitated. But anyway, from about that time I began to paint boats. My brother recently said he remembers one of those that was good enough that my grandmother hung it up in her house. But that was my way of dealing to this drowning experience without realizing it. And I pursued a lot of things about water, as you know, Bruce. But it took me 16 years to get the feeling released. I knew about this because it was in the paper that my 6-year-old brother had finally pulled me out, and my grandmother always talked about it. She'd look at me and shake her head and say, "Oh, Donnie, you should be dead already."
I'm Bruce Moon. The title of this video documentary is Art is Life is Art. We'll be exploring the life and work of Don Jones, artist, teacher, theologian, social activist, and pioneer in the profession of art therapy. As a 19-year-old conscientious objector and member of the Civilian Public Service Corps, Don began using art as a way to help the chronically mentally ill patients at Marlborough State Hospital during World War II. For nearly 6 decades, he has worked with adolescents and adults suffering all manner of mental and emotional disturbances. Along the way, he's painted out his own life story.
Called in like a river. He's seen 10,000 tears from folks who could not talk. Looked back on a lifetime with folks too old to walk. And he painted lonely roads, men all filled with fire. And he wrestled with some demons, man, he was inspired. Love called him like a river, rolling to the sea. From the mountains to the wheat fields to a place in history.
And I think I have the painting here. In my early teens, when I was given some oil paints, I went out to paint. I thought I'd teach myself to paint. And I began painting a tree. And the most wonderful thing happened is that the more I got involved with painting, the more I became the tree. And I thought to myself, this art is different from what I learned in school. But I thought my brain really has a mind of its own. And that was planting one of those seeds that I learned, this wonderful brain that we have. At age 18, when I registered for the draft, I registered as a conscientious objector. And although I was enrolled in Marietta College in my first year, studying, if you can believe it, theology and medicine. But when my number came up, I asked myself, where am I going to be in 12, 15 years of study? Will I be a doctor, a theologian, whatever? I didn't think so. So I dropped out of school, although I could have been allowed to go on, and went into selective service under General Hersey. And that got me involved in a civilian public service program that got me in a labor camp. And after 6 months in that, I volunteered to be a guinea pig in a medical experiment for the Army Medical Corps, and then volunteered to work in a state mental hospital for the next 3 years. And my conscious roots of art therapy happened there. I've often called it my University of Psychiatry because it taught me so much. We worked 8 hours a day, 6 days a week, alone on these wards, and I have pictures to prove it. Some of them they have been in articles that you've seen, but there were many episodes there that planted in my mind the power of the art, not only in the little time I had to paint myself, but I also collected the scratchings on the wall and the graffiti that the patients did. And I thought, wow, this is more than just graffiti. This is soul language. These people are saying, I am still alive. It's not her name, but I've often mentioned Sophie, who was most of the time in seclusion, but the times I'd let her out, she'd do these fantastic scratchings on the wall. And it so happened I finally got one day off, and because Marlborough Hospital is an hour away on the Jersey Central to New York City, I went straight to the Modern Museum of Art. And there I saw two things that wowed me. One was Mondrian's Broadway Boogie, which I hadn't quite seen that kind of thing before, and the other, on a huge wall, was Picasso's Guernica. And I thought, my God, it looks like Sophie's stuff, or Sophie's looks like that powerful thing. And I thought, aha, there's something about this art process and what happens to us when we do it that people are not talking about. One night I was walking along quietly, and I felt two heavy hands on my shoulders from the back. Say your prayers, white boy. You're the one who gave me the black pills. You have to learn to survive. So I took his hands and turned him around and held on to him and looked up at him, and I said, Joe, I know there's a lot of terrible stuff going on in your head, and it's painful. But it's almost morning. Go back to bed. Yes, boss. But there was a piano, an old broken up piano, and I learned that one of the patients who just went around mumbling, but everybody called him Billy, and sometimes Billy Blue. I found out that Billy Blue, as confused as he was, played piano for Cab Calloway. I bought some cigarettes. I don't believe in that. And I'd offer Billy Blue 2 cigarettes if he'd play. And he'd put them both in his mouth, and he'd play. And we would jump, and we would dance. So that's where I learned to deal with the things that later were valuable at Harding and Menninger's.
When the war ended, Don found work as a commercial artist, and eventually he and his young family settled in Rossville, Kansas. For a period of time, he served as the pastor for the Methodist Church, taught art classes in the evening, and engaged townspeople in painting a number of large murals in churches, the high school, and community center. In 1951, he was invited to join the adjunctive therapy staff at the Menninger Clinic. In October of 2009, I went to Rossville to interview people who'd known and worked with him in the 1950s and 60s. Don's oldest son, Dave, met me there and served as my tour guide.
You know, I think I was maybe 4 when we moved here, but in terms of conscious life experience, this is truly where I grew up, in this town, and this church was a big part of it. In the community, I think my father had a role not only as minister, but was known to one and all as an artist. And if there was a blank wall somewhere in this town, as you have found, he was determined to fill it with something. So it was not that, you know, doing his art in isolation, it was out there for everybody to experience. And some of the bigger projects, you know, the community center, he managed to draw other people into as well. One of the other experiences for me was the Friday night group. And I don't know how old I was when that started, but on Friday evenings, my folks would basically open the door, and which meant for many years opening the door to the garage, which was the studio. It was a pretty cool place, and people from work at Menninger's would come. There were some folks from Washburn University in Topeka, and I remember as a kid, before bedtime came, being allowed to sit and listen, and you know, folks worked at easels and painted and talked, and whether it was politics or, you know, whatever the topic was, it was very stimulating for me as a kid, and I was aware that there probably wasn't any place else in this little town where there were a group of people like that getting together to kind of share ideas and opinions and challenge one another.
You know, there are people that you meet in your life that make a lasting impression. I'm not a very eloquent person, but okay. Particularly in hindsight, it's pretty easy to say that Don Jones is a person that had a positive effect on my life, personally.
Well, I'll kind of start at the beginning. Don and Ellie came in 47, 48, somewhere along there. Anyway, he and I became good friends. Just not only he was my pastor, but good friends. So we got to know each other pretty well. And Don was well respected in his work and his work with patients. Very, very kind and very caring and excellent with patients. And then when Don left in 64, 65, I guess, when he left, but by that time he had become active. He started and worked with the art therapy. That was kind of, he and Bob Alt were the two guys that really started that kind of, I guess you'd say, diagnostic work.
As I understand it, there was a series of paintings that you did about that period of time that got Dr. Menninger's attention?
Yes, that's correct. I happened to be teaching night school, and most of the students in it were social workers and psychologists from Menninger's, and they learned about these paintings that I had done and told Dr. Carl Menninger about them, excuse me. And he wrote me a note saying, could we borrow them for our state hospital museum room? And I wrote back, having just been discharged, and said to this giant of psychiatry, if you can imagine, yes, you can borrow these, but you've got to have me too. And bless that man, he said, come. And he mentored me until he died. I also met, in fact, I invited Margaret Naumberg to come. But she came, and I got out a case that we could discuss. And of course, it was a public thing in the sense that there were about 50 residents. She immediately, being psychoanalytically oriented, thought in this environment that she'd go psychoanalytic. So she began analyzing this picture and this case. And I began saying, gently arguing with her, no, no, no. This is not about taking a painting apart. This is about the process. And that was the beginning of my talk and writing about process versus content, which was a new idea that I planted in the program at Menninger's also.
In his role at the hospital and as well as in the community, I think one of the things that he did was kind of poke at people and push people, agitate a little bit sometimes to affect positive change. The hospital was in some ways a very conservative operation, and I think some of the changes that happened to the hospital I would attribute to Don's pushing to be more open to new things.
After 16 years at Menninger's, Don was invited to become the director of the Adjunctive Therapies Department at Harding Hospital in Worthington, Ohio. The medical director, Dr. George Harding, was convinced that Don could design a milieu therapy approach that would regard every aspect of the patient's experience in the hospital as a potential therapeutic opportunity. He assembled a talented and diverse staff and implemented a program that included elements of work, recreation, education, relationship building, and of course, art making. Early in this phase of his career, Don collaborated with Myra Levick, Bob Alt, Felice Cohen, and Eleanor Allman to form the American Art Therapy Association.
Eleanor Allman and Margaret Naumberg were acquainted and felt really that if there was to be any field in art therapy, they owned it. They felt that they had originated it, that it belonged to them, and they fought tooth and nail to prevent the formation of a formal American Art Therapy Association of any sort. Speak of pioneer and founder and things like that, but this is something that took hold of me. When I took office as president of ADA in New York, in the New York City meeting, I recalled a childhood memory of being very small and my mother taking me to the circus. I was so small that the rope that held back the people was right up here to my eyes, you know. Well, the ringmaster said the first 12 children to get out to the ring can ride the elephant. Off I went, and they boosted me up on top of this elephant, kneeling elephant. And then the elephant got up and began to move. And I said to the people in New York, that's how I feel about becoming president of ADA. I'm not leading, I am being lifted and carried by this. And that's the way I feel about the art, the doing, the art process as well.
Mr. Jones, are you an artist or a therapist?
Well, Andy, that's a tough question for an art therapist, but I would have to answer with a definite, I'm an artist.
Says art is like eating, I just do it to survive.
I'm an artist.
There's paint inside his veins.
I'm an artist. I'm an artist.
Love called him like a river, rolled into the sea. From the mountains to the wheat fields to a place in history. Love called him like a river.
Were to ask you to draw how you're feeling right now, what would you draw? This is you lying down here?
Yeah, down here, just really tired and just gonna lay back and watch the rest of the world. It can go on its own way. This is where I belong, down here at the bottom. I'm just gonna stay down here.
But you seem to have this fountain of red that's coming up out of you. What is that?
Well, it's a fire that's burning inside me. It's singeing me, but it's some kind of energy. It's like my soul or my spirit, the poetry I write.
It's the fire inside you.
So you get the idea? The essential evolutionary role of the arts is to harness this power. By declaring, in the beginning, art was made to overcome chaos. That's the beginning of my Bible.
I've been looking back over some of your writings, and one of the ideas that you talk about that I had never really thought of in quite the same way was your notion that openness creates openness. Can you say something about that a little bit?
Yes. My life experience as a kid taught me that, but also in the state hospital taught me that the more you can be open with people, the more safe they feel. And interestingly enough, I've written then about this co-subjective process that I'm sure goes on. I've experienced it as a child and intuitively felt there's something going on there. As a matter of fact, that's why I hired you.
This happens every now and then, wild flashes out of the blue.
In the spring of 1974, I was finishing up my first year of graduate school at Methodist Theological School in Ohio, and I had no idea what I wanted to be when I grew up. I knew I wanted to do something that had to do with making art and music and sports, something that would challenge my creativity, put me in touch with the deepest parts of my fellow human beings, and maybe have a spiritual component too. But whatever that was, when I was 23 years old, I didn't have a clue. And then, through a series of coincidences, I met Don Jones for lunch at the L&K restaurant in Worthington, Ohio, one April Friday, and he told me about this new field, art therapy, and I was hooked. Near the end of lunch, he asked if I'd be interested in being his apprentice for a year, and I said yes. My first day was September 16th, 1974, and when I got home that night I was so excited I could hardly sleep. When I finished my apprenticeship, there happened to be a job opening at Harding Hospital. Don asked if I'd like to join the staff, and I said yes.
Yeah, the world can be a cold place and life can be so hard. That he walked in others' nightmares and he helped them see the stars. And he's been inside some prisons, some caves deep within. And he knows the depth of madness and he'd do it all again. Love called him like a river, rolled into the sea.
My desire and even belief is that beauty and poetry will help save the world. We've tried the generals, we've tried the politicians, we've tried the religions, but we haven't tried art enough. I believe in it because it is the only thing that is not based on the aggressive drive. And I am, what should I call it, Eros Pilgrim.
My father died on January 1st, 1953. I was 18 months old. He was 41. He died of a heart attack. He'd been wounded in World War II, and my mother said he was never quite the same after the war. When he died on New Year's Day, he left behind my 3 older sisters, my mom, and me. I have no memory of him that I can claim as my own. I have family stories. That's all. Consequently, I spent much of my early life looking around for potential adoptive fathers. I looked to coaches and teachers, other family members, and the question that I unconsciously framed at all of these would-be adoptive fathers was, will you tell me what to do so that I can do it and assure that I'm an acceptable young man? Well, when I began my internship in art therapy at Harding Hospital in 1974, I was confident that at last I had found my perfect adoptive father in the person of Don Jones. This marvelous man was part magician, part guru, part living legend, and I was sure that at last he would tell me what to do and I'd do it. Early on in the internship, Don began to insist that I paint again. I had been fairly artistically inactive for the year or so prior to the internship. The painting that grew over a few weeks plagued me. One day I would look at it with pride, the next day I found it repulsive. When the piece was nearly finished, I shared my ambivalence about it with Don. He suggested that I bring the painting to the student process group when I finished it. As you might guess, I had some ambivalence about that, too. On one level, I looked forward to that opportunity. At another level, I wanted to avoid it at all costs. Well, finally the day came, and I brought the painting to the student group. Don asked me to give an overview of the images, and I gave a brief synopsis of all the different parts of the painting that I thought were really intriguing and interesting. And when I got to the still life section in the upper right-hand corner, I said, oh, and this is just something I've done a lot. It really doesn't mean much. It's a painting about my feelings about the Vietnam War. I was irritated that when I had completed my synopsis, Don suggested that we begin by focusing our attention on the still life section. At some point, Don asked me to imagine myself being the American flag, to give it a voice, talk about how it felt about being nailed to the wall. As I began to talk, I began to sweat. I suddenly found myself being overcome with feelings, and until finally I started to shake and I couldn't talk at all. In a very gentle voice, Don said, Bruce, have you ever seen this flag before? And I was stunned. I had indeed seen it before, not only in the many paintings that I'd done about my being a conscientious objector to the war, but also lying folded in my mother's cedar chest. It was the flag that had covered my dad's casket. 24 years of rage and sadness and loss and hurt came pouring out, and I wept. My life has been forever changed by that painting and by that interaction with Don Jones.
I look in the mirror and say, okay, Don, what's happening? And I paint what's happening, and it's my consult with myself. Like that one, looking in the mirror there. So painting is what I do, because it gets me into that tertiary place.
I remember asking you once what was your favorite painting, and her response was immediately the next one, and that has always stuck with me.
Yes. I suppose it's a kind of healthy addiction, but it's more than that. I can stop. Once in a while I flirt with the idea of poetry, which is hard because my two older brothers are elegant poets. Just received 150 poems from my brother who's still alive. My other brother was a political writer. The middle brother was a musician, and what could I do but paint? If you use your head and heart, you could make 200 observations in 2 minutes. Because this wondrous brain that we have does 1 quadrillion perceptual scannings per second. Of course, our neocortex, that new part of us, can't possibly handle that. But it gives us gestalts, to give us a sense of reality. Access to people's trauma is mostly because it's planted in a place which is not reachable by words. Access is only through imagery. Freud was right more than he knew when he said, imagery is the royal road. Without going the circuitous route of talk, the more educated we get in art therapy, the farther away we seem to get sometimes.
Well, one of my hopes for this video documentary is that it will long outlive me, and it will be an archive for future generations of art therapists. As you think about those future generations that are toddlers now, what would you like a message to them to be?
Yes, if you would do it. Something like just a scan of my involvement in art. I'm a secular mystic because my time is short. I'm avoiding abstractions. I know what awesome is. I know what mysterium tremendum is. And I don't know about soul. Okay. I do know, poetically, metaphorically, of course. It is a neuroaesthetic answer to unanswerable questions. Blessed is the man who can't tell the difference between his vocation and his avocation. That's me.
Yeah, perfect.
That's me. The aesthetic spirit is life-saving and life-giving. My hope is that it will be beauty and poetry that may help save the world. The experience of conception, birth, nurturing, and growth of the American Art Therapy Association have been full of graces, epiphanies, and exclamations for me. And I must exclaim one more thanks.
Love called in my river. Well, to me he was part legend, part father and part friend. And I worked with him for 15 years, I was sad to see it end. When I think about the things he did and all the stuff he'd say,